Kneel down on a hard floor. Put both palms flat on a rough stone about the size of a dinner plate, and push forward and back, forward and back, leaning the whole weight of your upper body into it. Now, keep doing that for 6 hours. That is roughly how somebody made a single day's bread. Not in a bakery, and not this morning. Around 30,000 years ago, on the cold floor of an Ice Age camp, some 20,000 years before anyone on Earth pushed a seed into a field on purpose. We tend to believe bread begins with farming. It doesn't. And the tool that made it left its mark in the strangest possible place. Not buried in the dirt, but written into the bones of the people, mostly women, who spent their lives bent over it. Here's the picture most of us carry around. Bread means wheat. Wheat means farming. Farming means the Neolithic, those first mud brick villages of the Fertile Crescent, maybe 11,000 years ago, where somebody finally planted a crop on purpose. So bread, in that tidy version, is young, a reward for agriculture. The trouble is that nearly every step of that timeline is wrong, and wrong by tens of thousands of years. The grindstone came long before the farm, the flour came long before the field, and to see it, you don't begin in a wheat field at all. You begin on the shore of a lake, in what is now northern Israel, under water that only recently handed the whole thing back. The site is called Ohalo II, on the southwest shore of the Sea of Galilee, and we can study it at all because of a fluke. In 1989, the lake level dropped and exposed a camp that had been sealed under water and mud for 23,000 years. Waterlogging is savage on stone and bone, but it is astonishingly kind to plants. So what the archaeologist Donnie Nadell and his team recovered was almost unbelievable. The floors of 6 brush huts, open hearths, a human grave, and something like 150,000 plant remains. Sitting on the floor of one hut was a flat basalt grinding stone, and in 2004, in the journal Nature, the archaeobotanists Dolores Piperno of the Smithsonian and Ehud Weiss of the University of Haifa reported what was wedged into its tiny cracks: starch grains of wild wheat, wild barley, and wild oats. Somebody had ground cereals into flour on that stone, 23,000 years ago. Just outside the same hut lay a hearth ringed with flat stones, essentially an oven, hinting that the flour was mixed with water and baked into a kind of flatbread. Ohalo has since yielded something even more provocative, the earliest hints anywhere of people tending and trialing wild cereals, a faint rehearsal for farming a full 20,000 years too early. That alone breaks the timeline. But the trail runs deeper and colder. Travel to central Italy, to a site called Bilancino, in the hills near Florence, and back another 7,000 years, to roughly 30,000 years ago. In 2010, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the Italian prehistorian Anna Revedin and her colleagues published the residues scraped from grinding tools at Bilancino, at Kostenki in Russia, and at Pavlov in the Czech Republic. 3 sites, more than 1,000 kilometers apart, scattered across Ice Age Europe, and all 3 carried the same signature: starch, ground fine. Except here it wasn't cereal at all. It was the root of the cattail, the bulrush that grows at the edge of every pond, along with fern. People were digging up starchy roots, drying them, and milling them into flour 30,000 years ago. This was not a lucky one-off. It was a shared technology, and it stretched across a continent. And it gets older still. In a cave in southern Italy called Grotta Paglici, one small grinding stone pushes the date back further than anywhere else on Earth, to about 32,600 years ago. In 2015, again in Pinas, the botanist Marta Mariotti Lippi and Revedin's team analyzed its surface and found starch from wild oats. But they found something more sophisticated than plain grinding. The starch grains were swollen and altered in a way that only happens with heat, meaning the grain had been warmed or gently cooked before it was ground. That's not somebody randomly smashing a seed. That's a recipe, a deliberate, multi-step process, heat and then grind, worked out and handed down more than 30,000 years ago, and probably ending in a warm porridge or a rough flat cake. And this is worth pausing on, because grinding isn't just crushing. A raw wild grain, or a fibrous root, is close to useless to your body. The calories are locked inside a shell you can barely digest. Grind it into flour, add water and heat, and you unlock all of it. A dense, storable, portable hit of energy that can carry a child, or a whole camp, through a brutal winter. So a flat stone and a strong pair of arms weren't a convenience. They were a survival machine, a way to turn an inedible landscape into food. But the machine ran on muscle, and the arithmetic is grim. Feeding a single family for one day could take hours of grinding, with no engine to speed it up and no one else to pass it to, which is exactly why people were willing to pay such a steep price to run one. Now the picture sharpens as we move toward the edge of farming. In the Levant, modern Israel, Jordan, and Syria, a people we call the Natufians were carving deep, narrow mortars straight down into solid bedrock around 12,500 years ago. For a long time, nobody was certain what those rock-cut holes were for. In 2015, in the journal PLOS One, the archaeologist David Item, working with the late Harvard prehistorian Ofer Bar Yosef and others, tested them the obvious way, by processing wild barley in faithful reconstructions. The holes turned out to be superb at exactly two jobs: stripping the tough husk off the grain and pounding the kernels into flour. This was purpose-built grain machinery, cut into the ground, 2,000 to 3,000 years before anybody in the region farmed a single field. Up to this point, every site has handed us flour and tools and ovens, but the bread itself has been an inference, because dough rots. Then, at a site called Shubaika 1, in the Black Desert of northeastern Jordan, someone finally found the loaf. In 2018, in PLOS, the archaeobotanist Amaya Aranz Oteegui and her team reported 24 charred crumbs raked out of two ancient fireplaces, the burnt remains of a thin, unleavened bread, baked by hunter-gatherers 14,400 years ago. It is the oldest actual bread ever found, and it beats the arrival of farming in that region by at least 4,000 years. These people were not farmers. They were foragers who gathered wild grain, ground it, shaped it, and baked it, and left the char and the ashes for us to dig up. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. All that flour, at every one of these sites, had to be made by hand, by human beings, on their knees, driving a stone back and forth for hours a day after day after day. That much repetition doesn't just produce flour, it reshapes a body. At a site in Syria called Abu Huraira, the anthropologist Thea Mollison of the Natural History Museum in London studied the skeletons of the people who lived there as farming was taking hold, and she could read the grinding in their bones. Writing in Scientific American in 1994, she laid it out. Big toes with the joints permanently bent from crouching on curled-under feet, knees worn and arthritic from kneeling on hard ground, lower spines curved and crushed from leaning forward under load, arm and shoulder bones overbuilt like an athlete's from the endless back and forth, and the damage fell overwhelmingly on one group, women and girls, from adolescence onward. The daily grind was never a metaphor, it was a life sentence, served on the knees, and it was mostly served by women. And if you assume all of that ended with prehistory, it didn't. Step into a village kitchen in rural Mexico or Guatemala even a century ago, and you'd have found the very same scene, a woman on her knees at a metate, a sloping stone slab, grinding maize into dough for the day's tortillas, 3 or 4 hours of it, in the same posture, paying in the same joints Mollison found at Abu Huraira. Anthropologists who have studied those women's skeletons see the same marks turn up again, the bent toes, the worn knees, the overbuilt arms. 30,000 years apart, the same stone left the same signature on the same bones. This one tool, this one motion, ran quietly underneath human life for more than 30,000 years, and across almost all of that stretch it was powered by nothing but somebody's aching arms and knees. Now, one honest caution before the big claim. That 23,000-year-old bread at Ohalo is real flour but inferred baking. We have the grindstone, the wild cereal starch, and the oven-like hearth, but no surviving loaf from that exact moment. The oldest crumb we can literally hold is the 14,000-year-old one from Jordan. And a handful of researchers point out that some early grinding stones may occasionally have been used on pigments or other materials, not only food. Those are fair objections, but the starch grains themselves are very hard to argue away. When you find wild wheat starch packed into the cracks of a stone, somebody, at some point, was grinding wheat on it. So here is the reframe, and it turns the whole story of bread inside out. We hand all the credit to farming, to the plow, the field, the planted seed. But flour is at least 20,000 years older than any farm, and a baked flatbread is 4,000 years older. The field did not invent bread, the grindstone did, and a growing number of archaeologists now suspect the cause and effect runs the opposite way from how we usually tell it. Grinding wild grain into flour is what made those tiny, fiddly seeds worth the effort in the first place, worth gathering, worth guarding, and eventually worth planting on purpose. In other words, we may not have taken up grinding because we started to farm. We may have started to farm because, for 20,000 years, we had already been grinding. Line it all up. 32,000 years ago, a heated then ground handful of wild oats in an Italian cave. 30,000 years ago, cattail root flour on grinding stones from Florence to the plains of Russia. 23,000 years ago, wheat and barley milled, and probably baked, on a lakeshore in Israel. 14,000 years ago, an actual charred loaf in a Jordanian fire pit. 12,500 years ago, bedrock mortars husking wild barley across the Levant. And underneath every one of those dates, a person on their knees, pushing a stone, performing the oldest, most invisible labor in the human story. Which brings it back to you, and the last piece of bread you ate without a single thought. You tore it, you chewed it, you moved on. But that soft, ordinary thing sits at the end of a chain more than 30,000 years long. A chain of hearths and handstones and worn-out knees. Most of them belonging to women whose names we will never know. Who spent hours of every single day turning hard, wild seeds into something a family could actually eat. They did it before there were farms, before there were villages, before there was a single planted seed anywhere on earth. Kneeling in the cold, driving stone against stone, hour after hour, so that the people around them could eat, and keep eating, through winters that killed the unprepared. Every loaf you have ever tasted was invented and paid for by them. The next time you pick one up, you are holding the oldest recipe on earth, and one of the oldest debts we never think to acknowledge. All the research is linked in the description.